I still remember the first time my grandmother's voice shook when she told us never to say his name. I was 6, and it sounded like one of those silly rules adults make up to scare children. But there was something in her eyes, something that made my stomach twist and my small hands clammy. It wasn't just a warning. It was fear, raw and heavy, that seemed to fill the room more than her words ever could. I asked her why, and she only shook her head, pressing her lips together like she was sealing something inside. That was the first moment I realized that some things in our family weren't meant to be spoken of. Some things were better left in the shadows. That night, in my little bedroom, I couldn't stop thinking about her words. The house was quiet, too quiet, and the darkness seemed to press against the walls like it wanted to listen. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to tell myself it was just my imagination. But then I saw it. A shadow flicker across the corner of the room, swift and impossible, almost like it was aware I was watching. My heart thumped so hard I was sure she could hear it from downstairs. I pulled the blanket up over my shoulders, but the chill didn't go away. It wasn't just the shadow. There was a whisper, faint and breathy, curling around my ears. I couldn't make out the words, but I felt the intent behind them, like it was speaking directly to me, testing me. I wanted to run, to scream, but my body refused to obey. Fear had planted itself in my chest, heavy and unmoving. I stayed like that for hours, half-conscious, eyes wide, listening to the house breathe around me. The creak of the floorboards, the hum of the wind against the window, every small sound felt amplified, as if the house itself were alive, watching, waiting. I realized then that the warning was not empty, that the weight of my grandmother's fear was a burden passed down, and I had just inherited the first taste of it. When morning finally came, the shadow was gone, the whisper faded, but the memory stayed, etched into my mind with a sharpness I could not forget. I understood, even at 6, that some names carry power, some names carry danger. And that night, I learned that one name in particular was not ours to speak, no matter how curious, no matter how small we were. And I knew even then that the house was waiting for me to forget. The first thing I notice when I step into my grandmother's house is the air itself. It feels heavy, like it's carrying 100 years of dust, memory, and something I can't name. It clings to my skin and fills my nose with the smell of old wood and faded flowers. The house is quiet, almost too quiet, but not in a peaceful way. It feels like it's holding its breath, waiting for me to make a mistake. The portraits catch my attention first. They line the walls in every room, staring down with eyes that feel alive. Some are of people I vaguely recognize, ancestors whose names were whispered like secrets. Their expressions are solemn, their eyes sharp, and I swear I feel them studying me, judging me. I move closer, and the shadows around them seem to twitch, stretching across the walls like they are trying to warn me. I wander slowly through the rooms, each step creaking under my weight. The floorboards moan as if complaining, and somewhere deep in the house, a door clicks shut on its own. I freeze, listening. The wind rattles a loose window, and I think I hear soft murmurs, voices too faint to understand. No one is here, but the house feels full of presence, heavy with the echoes of lives long past. I run my fingers along the furniture, thick with dust, and I feel the weight of every day that has passed since my grandmother was last here. It is more than just neglect. The house feels like it remembers. Every corner holds a memory, every shadow a secret. I sense something watching, something patient, waiting for me to notice. I try to shake off the feeling, but it follows me from room to room. There is a hallway I have never dared to explore before, lined with more portraits and the faint smell of damp wood. As I walk down it, the air seems colder, heavier. I feel a brush of air against my arm, but there is nothing there. The whispers grow clearer, though I cannot understand them. They are old voices, voices that carry guilt, fear, and warning. I know instinctively that this presence is tied to my family, to the sins my ancestors tried to bury. By the time I leave the hallway, I am shaken. I do not understand it fully, but I feel the house marking me, weighing me, testing me. The dust and shadows cling to me like a second skin. I realize then that this place is alive, not in the way of creaking wood or shifting light, but in the way of memory and guilt, and I have only just begun to feel the weight of what it remembers. Something in the air shifts, subtle but unmistakable, like it is acknowledging me, and I know I am being watched. The attic door had always been locked, and I never dared ask why. Even my grandmother avoided the subject, her eyes darkening whenever it came up. But that afternoon the storm outside seemed to push me forward, urging me to look where I shouldn't. Lightning flashed across the sky, and I found the key tucked away in an old drawer, hidden beneath yellowed papers. My hands shook as I held it, torn between fear and curiosity. I knew I probably shouldn't, but I couldn't resist. The lock clicked open with a sound that echoed down the empty hallway. I paused, listening to the rain hammer against the roof, the wind rattling the shutters. Taking a deep breath, I turned the handle and pushed the door slowly. A gust of musty air met me, thick and heavy, carrying the smell of decay and old wood. The attic was dark, but the lightning lit it in sharp, sudden flashes. Dust swirled in the light, dancing like tiny spirits disturbed by my presence. I stepped inside carefully, my shoes creaking against the uneven boards. The space was full of shadows, corners I couldn't see, and piles of forgotten belongings. Every object felt like it was waiting, holding its breath as if it knew I was not supposed to be there. My eyes fell on a small table covered in dust. On it lay a journal, the leather cracked and brittle with age. I opened it carefully, the pages brittle beneath my fingers, and saw handwriting that trembled across the paper, like someone had poured their fear into every letter. The words spoke of something unspeakable, something that needed to be named, yet could not be. There were lists, notes, sketches, all obsessive and precise, as if the writer had been trying to contain a presence that had no form. My heart pounded as I read, a cold sweat forming on my neck. The attic seemed to pulse with a life of its own, the shadows shifting just beyond my vision. I felt a weight pressing down on me, a silent reminder that some doors, some knowledge were forbidden for a reason. I wanted to leave, but a part of me, the part that had always been curious, whispered to stay. The storm outside raged harder, lightning illuminating the attic like a stage for something ancient. I closed the journal reluctantly, sensing it was watching me, recording my intrusion. As I backed toward the door, I felt it, a subtle, almost imperceptible presence, like eyes following my every movement. I left the key on the table, but I knew, somehow, that the attic had already marked me. And as I stepped back into the hallway, the wind carried a soft, almost mocking whisper, one I could not place, but would never forget. That night, the house felt different, alive in a way I hadn't noticed before. I was lying in bed, staring at the wall, when I thought I heard it. A soft murmur, almost like someone speaking behind the wallpaper. The words were unintelligible, jumbled, but they carried a warning, a tone that made my stomach tighten and my hands cold. I told myself it was my imagination, the storm outside playing tricks on me, but every instinct screamed that it was something more. The shadows in the room seemed to twitch in response, stretching and shrinking as if they had a life of their own. I could feel the pulse of the house, slow and steady, and yet it matched the racing of my own heart. Every creak in the floorboards, every groan of the roof, sounded deliberate, like the house was trying to speak in its own language. I sat up, pulling the blanket tightly around me, listening to the rhythm, wondering what it wanted me to hear. The air smelled faintly of damp wood and old dust, with a sharp edge of something metallic, something unplaceable. I ran my fingers along the wall, feeling the roughness of the plaster beneath my palm, and I swore I could feel vibrations, subtle, almost like the walls themselves were breathing. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it, trying to tell myself I was safe. But the murmurs grew louder, more insistent, curling around my ears, beckoning me closer. I got out of bed, drawn toward the corner of the room where the sound seemed strongest. The closer I moved, the more the whispers twisted, teasing, warning, almost impatient. My reflection in the dark window caught my eye, pale and tense, wide-eyed, and I realized I was holding my breath. The house seemed to lean in toward me, the shadows deepening, almost solid, brushing against my skin with unseen fingers. I wanted to retreat, to hide under the covers, but a part of me, the part that had always been curious, urged me forward. The whispers promised answers, secrets I wasn't sure I wanted to know. I felt the air shift, like a slow exhale, and the temperature dropped. Every nerve in my body screamed that I should run, that I should leave the room and never return. But then, just as quickly as it started, the murmurs stopped. Silence fell heavy, the kind of silence that presses against your chest and makes it hard to breathe. I froze, heart hammering, knowing the house had said something, and I had almost listened. And deep down, I knew it was only the beginning. I pressed my grandmother that evening, desperate to know why we were never to speak his name. Her hands shook as she clutched the edge of the table, knuckles white, eyes darting to the shadows of the room as if they could hear us. I could see the fear in her face, the kind that wasn't pretend or exaggerated, but real, bone-deep fear. My curiosity burned hotter than any warning she could give, and I needed to understand. She leaned back in her chair, taking a long, trembling breath, and began. Her voice was low, almost a whisper, each word measured as though it might awaken something. She spoke of a debt, one that our family had never paid, of a betrayal that reached across generations. There was a presence, she said, that claimed lives silently, leaving no trace but the memory of loss and the weight of guilt. I wanted to ask more, to press for details, but her eyes warned me to stop, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I listened as she recounted fragments of the story, scenes of cold rooms and vanished people, shadows that moved against the light, and a sense that the house itself remembered every sin. I felt my stomach twist with unease, but I couldn't look away. Every line of her face told me that this was no superstition, no ghost story to frighten children. This was survival. Knowledge was dangerous, she warned, and some truths were heavier than any one person could bear. The house around us seemed to respond to her words. The air thickened, smelling faintly of smoke and old wood, and somewhere in the corner, a floorboard groaned as if to punctuate her warnings. I could hear the wind rattling the windows, but beneath it I thought I heard whispers, just for me. My heart raced. I understood, in a way I hadn't before, that fear could be a teacher, and that sometimes the greatest acts of protection were silent, unseen, and unspoken. By the time she fell silent, I felt the weight of the story pressing down on me, heavy as the house itself. I realized then that my curiosity was dangerous, that wanting to know more was part of what made the story powerful. The room seemed to settle, but the shadows lingered, watching. I left that night with a new understanding, a knowledge that my grandmother's warnings were not about keeping secrets for secrecy's sake. They were about survival, about protecting us from something older and colder than we could imagine. And in the quiet that followed, I felt the first stirrings of a presence that had been waiting for me to ask the wrong question. I found the photograph in the attic, hidden beneath a stack of yellowed papers, and the moment I saw it, my blood ran cold. The image was old, edges curled and fading, but the details were clear enough to make my heart pound. There was my grandmother, a little girl in a dress too fancy for play, smiling shyly at the camera. But behind her stood a man I did not recognize, someone whose presence seemed to press against the photograph itself. His eyes caught mine immediately. They glinted in a way that felt alive, almost as if they were following me across the room, cutting through the years between then and now. There was something wrong about him, a sense of patience and danger that settled heavy in my chest. I felt a shiver run from my neck down to my toes, and the attic seemed to lean closer, shadows pressing against the walls like they were curious about my reaction. I leaned in closer, trying to tell myself it was just a trick of the light, a reflection caught in the fading ink. But the more I stared, the more I felt it, a creeping dread curling around my ribs and squeezing. The air smelled faintly of dust and old wood, but there was something else, something metallic, like blood dried long ago. I dropped my hand onto the floor, steadying myself, and heard the faintest creak from the far corner, though the attic had been silent when I entered. I couldn't look away. The photograph felt like a window, a thin pane separating me from something that should not exist, something my grandmother had spent her life warning me about without ever naming. My stomach twisted, and I felt a pull, as if the man's gaze was tugging at my thoughts, teasing out the questions I wasn't supposed to ask. I tried to place him, to imagine a relative I had never known, but nothing fit. The familiarity was wrong, unnatural, like a shadow I remembered from a dream I had never had. I felt the attic shift, a draft moving against my neck, carrying whispers I couldn't understand, just soft, almost breath-like murmurs that made me jump. I set the photograph down carefully, but the sense of being watched did not leave. The shadows clung closer, and I understood something I had not fully grasped before. The stories were not exaggerations, the warnings not idle. Whatever had haunted our family, whatever my grandmother had feared, it had left traces, and for the first time I saw the proof in front of me. And I knew, even as I backed toward the door, that the attic had only just begun to show me its secrets. That evening, I heard it for the first time, and my blood ran cold. A voice, soft and coaxing, seemed to slip through the walls and the wind outside, weaving itself into the creaks of the floorboards. It called my name, low and deliberate, almost intimate, and I froze in place, unsure whether to run or to listen. My heart pounded in my chest, a frantic rhythm that matched the way the air felt heavier, pressing down on me like the house itself had leaned closer. I tried to convince myself it was the storm, the wind rattling the windows, or my own imagination playing tricks. But the voice was different. It had weight, a presence that was neither fully alive nor fully gone. It wound around my thoughts, coaxing, pulling, almost pleading. There was sorrow in it, a sadness that made my chest ache, but underneath I felt something darker, something patient, like it had waited decades for me to hear. I stepped cautiously toward the window, lightning flashing in the yard and casting long, twisted shadows that seemed to reach for me. The floor beneath my feet groaned, and I flinched as a draft carried the faintest scent of old paper and decay. I felt eyes on me, unseen but certain, and the voice continued, just out of reach, brushing the edges of my mind. It was seductive in a way I couldn't explain, dangerous yet compelling. I wanted to resist, but my body betrayed me, leaning forward, straining to hear more. I realized then that this was not just a sound, it was memory, longing, and something that demanded recognition. The house seemed to pulse with it, every shadow stretching, every corner listening. My skin prickled, my hands slick with sweat, and I knew that the voice could be leading me somewhere I did not want to go. I wanted to flee, but my curiosity anchored me. Deeper than fear could push me away. Minutes passed, or maybe hours, and the voice faded, slipping away like smoke through a crack in the wall. The storm outside softened, leaving the house still and silent, but the air remained charged, electric with something I could not name. I felt the memory of it lingering, a pull at the back of my mind that would not let me forget. And in that silence I understood something terrifying. It was patient, and it would not stop until it had my attention again. I found myself sifting through old letters and diaries one evening, and it felt like opening a door I wasn't meant to touch. The pages were yellowed, brittle at the edges, carrying the scent of old paper, dust, and a faint trace of something metallic I couldn't place. As I read, fragments of the family's past spilled into my mind, dark pieces I hadn't been allowed to know. There were accounts of disappearances, strange deaths that left no mark, and nights so silent that fear itself seemed to creep through the rooms. The more I read, the heavier the air became. The wind rattled the windows outside, but inside, the house seemed still, almost holding its breath as if it knew I was uncovering truths that had been buried for decades. I felt a chill run down my spine, the hairs on my arms standing as I traced the trembling handwriting of relatives I had never met. Each page spoke of the same presence, the same influence, reaching across generations, patient and relentless. I realized with a sinking heart that my grandmother's warnings were not idle threats. She hadn't been trying to scare us for the sake of superstition. She had been protecting us, shielding us from a legacy that could reach into the present, a presence that remembered old debts and punished curiosity with quiet cruelty. I could almost feel the weight of her fear pressing down on me, a reminder that the past was never truly gone. The letters told stories of people vanishing into the night, lives cut short without explanation, and shadows that lingered just beyond the edge of vision. There were hints of rituals, names never spoken aloud, and warnings scribbled hastily in margins. I felt a pull, a combination of dread and fascination, knowing I should stop reading, that some knowledge comes with consequences. But my fingers moved of their own accord, flipping through the pages, absorbing the weight of generations of fear and silence. As the storm outside picked up again, I felt a presence in the room with me, subtle, patient, waiting. The air thickened, carrying a faint whisper, like the house itself remembering every sin and every secret. I closed the last diary gently, but the sense of being watched did not leave. My grandmother's face came to mind, stern and protective, and I finally understood. She had been guarding us from this legacy, from something that thrived on memory and curiosity. And I knew in that moment that even the walls of the house remembered, and that some memories were better left forbidden. The storm outside hammered against the windows, lightning illuminating my room in brief, violent flashes when I saw him. He appeared suddenly, a figure translucent yet horrifyingly real, standing at the edge of my bed. I froze, my body refusing to move, heart hammering in my chest, as if trying to escape on its own. There was something about him that felt ancient, patient, and impossibly aware, like he had been waiting for this moment across decades of silence. He didn't speak, he didn't need to. His presence filled the room with a weight that pressed against my skin, cold and heavy. I could feel it in my chest, in my arms, even in the tips of my fingers, a chill that seeped into my bones. His eyes, or what I thought were eyes, pierced me, and I felt as though he was judging more than just me. He was looking at my family, at the generations that had come before, measuring the sins, the debts, the warnings ignored or whispered. The air smelled faintly of damp earth and old wood, mixed with something sharper, metallic, something that made my stomach twist. The room felt smaller, the shadows darker, as if the corners themselves had leaned in to watch. Every creak of the house, every groan of the wind seemed amplified, part of a rhythm I couldn't understand, but felt in every nerve. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, trying to tell myself it wasn't real, but the fear was too strong, the fascination too binding. Time stretched, seconds dragging like hours, and still he remained, silent and unmoving. I wanted to run, to escape, but my feet refused to obey. There was an intelligence in his stillness, an almost sentient patience that both terrified and enthralled me. I sensed the weight of my ancestors pressing down through him, through the very air of the room, a reminder that nothing here was ever simple or innocent. Then, as abruptly as he appeared, he was gone. The chill lingered, settling deep into the bed, the floor, the walls. I shivered violently, curling into myself, knowing he had been here, knowing he had left a mark no one else could see. Even in the quiet that followed, I could feel him watching from the edges, patient and unyielding, a presence that would not be ignored. And I knew, with a certainty that made my skin crawl, that this was only the beginning. Grandma's garden always seemed peaceful during the day, full of sunlight and the faint scent of roses and herbs. But that evening it felt different, almost alive with secrets. The shadows stretched long under the ancient oak, twisted roots snaking across the ground like dark veins. I knelt there, drawn by a curiosity I should have resisted, and my fingers brushed against something hard beneath the soil. I dug carefully, the earth cool and damp under my hands, smelling of decay and rain-soaked wood. The more I uncovered, the colder I felt, as if the soil itself was pressing against my skin, warning me to stop. And then I saw it, small bones, human, unmarked, hidden beneath the gnarled roots. My stomach twisted, my hands trembling, and I pulled back, realizing I had touched something no one was meant to disturb. The garden, the house, the air around me, it all felt charged with a weight I could not name. The wind whispered through the branches, carrying faint, almost imperceptible murmurs that made my heart race. I imagined the people these bones had belonged to, lives ended quietly, buried to be forgotten. And suddenly, my grandmother's warnings, her insistence on silence, made a terrible, undeniable sense. She had been protecting us from more than stories. I pressed my palms to my face, the soil still clinging to my skin, tasting faintly of iron. Every shadow in the garden seemed to twitch as if alive, watching, and I felt connected to a past I had no right to touch. Fear and guilt mingled, heavy in my chest, making it hard to breathe. The moonlight shone through the branches, illuminating the small clearing, but even that silver glow felt like it was hiding something, not revealing. I thought about the house behind me, the rooms filled with whispers, the walls that had listened and remembered. Everything seemed stained by silence, by generations of unspoken truths. My hands shook as I covered the bones again, pressing the earth back into place, trying to erase what I had uncovered. But I knew it was impossible. And as I stood under the oak, feeling the weight of unseen eyes, I realized that the garden had its own memory, one that waited patiently for someone to dig too deep. The roots seemed to pulse slightly, almost like they were alive, and I knew this was not the last secret the land would reveal. I went back to the attic that night, drawn by a mix of fear and an unrelenting curiosity I could not ignore. The air was thick, smelling of dust, old wood, and something faintly metallic, like blood dried long ago. The journal lay where I had left it, but it felt different somehow, as though it had grown impatient with me, waiting for my hands to touch it again. I opened it slowly, and the pages seemed to shift under my fingertips. The handwriting was more twisted than I remembered, almost alive, curling and slanting in ways that made my stomach tighten. Each word felt deliberate, purposeful, as if the pen itself wanted to speak to me, to warn me, to confide secrets I had no right to know. I leaned closer, the dim light from the attic window flickering across the pages, illuminating confessions and warnings written with a frantic intensity that made my pulse hammer. It became clear almost immediately that the man's name, the one my grandmother had forbidden, was not just a word. It was a vessel, a key, a conduit for something patient and terrible that had lingered too long. As I read, I felt the weight of generations pressing against the room, against me. The house seemed to hum in response, a low vibration through the floorboards, the walls, even the air itself. I shivered and pulled my sleeves over my hands, trying to steady myself, but the words kept pulling me deeper, revealing the extent of his influence, his reach across time, and the silent terror he had sown in every corner of our family history. I could almost hear his voice in the attic, soft, coaxing, threading through the shadows. The journal seemed to pulse beneath my fingers, warning me, challenging me, daring me to speak the forbidden name aloud. Fear clashed with fascination in a way that made my chest ache. I knew as I traced the letters with trembling hands that knowledge came with consequences, and some doors once opened could never be closed. The wind rattled the window behind me, carrying whispers that matched the rhythm of my own breath, and I felt eyes on me, though I could see nothing. The attic had shifted, alive with memory and menace. I closed the journal slowly, but the sense of being watched did not leave. I understood then that the story my grandmother had guarded all these years was not just about secrecy or superstition. It was about survival, about keeping something contained that should never walk freely again. And I knew deep in my bones that I had only just begun to understand the danger that waited for any misstep. I woke that morning to a quiet that felt heavier than usual. The kind that presses against your chest and makes your skin crawl. Sunlight filtered weakly through the curtains, casting long shadows that didn't belong. I glanced toward the photograph in the corner of the room, the one from the attic, and my stomach turned. The man in the photograph had shifted. His posture was slightly different, and the glint in his eyes felt sharper, more deliberate, as if he had noticed me. The air seemed to thicken around me, carrying the faint smell of damp wood and something darker, metallic and unsettling. I walked closer, heart hammering, but the house was too quiet. Even the floorboards didn't creak under my weight. Every shadow felt alive, twitching at the edge of my vision. I tried to tell myself it was imagination, that a photograph couldn't move, but the unease clinging to my skin told a different story. Mirrors in the hallway reflected odd angles, shadows that should not have existed. The corners of rooms seemed to lean inward, hiding whispers just beyond comprehension. I could feel it watching, the presence adjusting to my movements, aware of my probing. I shivered, the memory of my grandmother's warnings pressing into my mind. This wasn't just a haunted house, it was alive with something patient, something that didn't want me uncovering its secrets. I noticed small details that had never been there before, the faint shift of a chair, the way the curtains fluttered, though the air was still, the softest creak of the staircase, as if someone or something was pacing just out of sight. My hands were clammy, and I clenched them into fists, trying to steady the trembling in my body. I wanted to leave, to retreat to somewhere that felt safe, but the curiosity that had carried me this far wouldn't let me. I stared at the photograph again, feeling that weight settle in my chest, an awareness that stretched beyond the paper and into the very air I breathed. I realized then that the house reacted to me, each movement, each thought, each whispered question answered, in the subtle, terrifying ways of shadows and reflections. And as I stepped back, a soft whisper brushed against the edges of my mind, impossible to place or understand, but clear in intent. It did not approve, and it was waiting for me to slip. I had to confront my mother, even though every instinct screamed that I shouldn't. The questions burned on my tongue, the curiosity I had carried like a small, dangerous flame for years finally spilling over. I found her in the kitchen, the smell of old tea and lavender hanging faintly in the air. Her hands trembled as she stirred a cup, and when she looked up, her eyes were wide with fear. I asked about the family, about the stories my grandmother had kept hidden, the warnings about the man whose name we never spoke. She froze, and a silence fell between us that felt heavier than any words could carry. Her lips pressed into a thin line, and I realized instantly that some truths were too heavy for her to share. Her fear was tangible, a weight pressing down on the small kitchen, bending the air around us. The more I pressed, the more it became clear that silence was survival. Every whispered secret, every warning passed down through generations, had been a shield against something relentless, something that punished exposure. And yet, the weight of guilt had been passed down just as surely, binding us, shaping the way we moved through the world, the way we feared shadows and quiet nights. I could feel the family's history in the air, a subtle pressure that made my chest tighten. The house seemed to lean in, listening, carrying memories of unspoken debts, betrayals, and choices made long before I was born. It was not only supernatural presence that haunted us, it was the moral weight of our lineage, the consequences of actions forgotten, but never forgiven. Her eyes filled with tears, not for herself, but for the inevitability of it all. She could not save me, just as she had been unable to save herself, or my grandmother, or anyone who had lived under the gaze of our family's legacy. I realized then that the curse was not only a ghostly specter, not only shadows moving in rooms at night. It was ancestral, moral, relentless, threaded into the very bones of our family, carried silently from parent to child. I stepped back, feeling the pull of generations pressing against me. The kitchen, the house, the stories I had uncovered, all of it was a reminder that some legacies could never be escaped. And as I left the room, I understood fully why my grandmother had insisted on silence. Some knowledge comes at too high a cost, and survival often demands we carry the weight quietly, with no one to share it but the ghosts that watch us from the corners. Sleep became a battlefield. I could not escape. The moment my head touched the pillow, the dreams began. thick and suffocating, as if the air itself had turned to water. I saw him, always him, standing in places I had never been, yet somehow recognized. Shadows bent unnaturally around him, and the whispers of voices I could not place called my name, soft but insistent, tugging at something deep inside me. The room felt too small, too heavy, even in waking hours. I would wake in a sweat, heart pounding, the faint metallic scent of fear clinging to my skin. Sometimes I could hear him in the silence, just beyond the reach of understanding, a sigh, a creak, a whisper that lingered longer than any shadow should. The dreams blurred into reality, leaving me uncertain which world I was in, tethered to a presence I could neither see nor touch, yet could feel pressing against my mind. In the dreams, the house twisted and warped around me. Hallways stretched impossibly long, doors opened into rooms that should not exist, and mirrors reflected not my own face but his, fleeting, mocking, watching. I tried to close my eyes, to resist, but the more I struggled, the stronger the pull became. I felt him studying me, learning me, a patient predator waiting for me to falter. I would wake gasping, hands trembling, the sheets tangled around me like vines. The air smelled damp and earthy, the lingering scent of decay making me shiver even in the brightness of morning. Each day I felt weaker, more uncertain, haunted not only by what I saw in the night, but by the fear of what awaited when my eyes closed again. Even simple things became charged with dread. The floorboard creaking in the hall, the soft brush of wind against the window, the faint reflection of movement behind glass. The line between night and day, dream and reality, dissolved like fog. I could not trust what I saw, what I heard, or what I felt. By the fourth night I realized I was no longer sleeping. I was trespassing, wandering through a world he controlled, and every dream, every whisper, every shadow tethered me closer. I knew that the moment I closed my eyes, I risked crossing a line I might never return from. And when I awoke that morning, I could swear the air in the room had shifted, heavier, watching, waiting for me to succumb once more. The basement door had always been forbidden. Even as a child, I sensed its presence like a heartbeat beneath the house, steady and patient, waiting for someone foolish enough to open it. That night, the pull became unbearable. I stood before the door, my hand trembling, as I turned the rusty key I had found, tucked away in an old drawer. The lock clicked, and a shiver ran through me, cold and insistent, warning me to stop. The air that spilled from the stairwell was thick, fetid, carrying the sharp sting of damp stone and something else, something sour, almost metallic. It clung to my skin, and I drew a shuddering breath, trying to steel myself. Every step down the stairs felt heavier than the last, as though the air itself resisted my intrusion. Shadows stretched and twisted along the walls, alive in ways that made the hair on my arms stand on end. Ancient symbols were carved into the stone walls, faint but unmistakable, their meaning lost to time but their power palpable. I traced one with my fingers, the stone rough and cold, and the moment I touched it, a vibration hummed through the floor, low and insistent, like a heartbeat from beneath the earth. It was not welcoming, it was a warning. The basement seemed larger than it should have been, cavernous in the dim light. Crates and barrels lay scattered, their contents decayed into dust, yet the shadows between them felt dense, as if they contained more than air and darkness. I could hear something moving, subtle but deliberate, a scrape or a sigh that seemed just out of reach, always following me, always aware. I caught sight of old furniture, broken and rotting, but each piece seemed positioned with intent, guarding the corners, shielding something unseen. A chill ran down my spine, and I realized that this place had not been neglected. It had been prepared, consecrated in ways I did not yet understand, cementing a legacy that stretched back generations. The deeper I moved, the heavier the air became, pressing against my chest, making my heartbeat echo in my ears. I knew instinctively that whatever had been buried here, whether secret, curse, or memory, was waiting, patient, relentless, bound to the house and to my blood. As I turned toward a shadowed corner, I felt it, the unmistakable awareness of something watching, unseen but present, and I understood fully that I had crossed a line. The basement held more than objects or symbols. It held the unspeakable, the legacy of our family, and it was alive. The floorboards groaned beneath my weight, but it was something else that made me stop, frozen mid-step. Beneath the creaking wood, I heard it soft at first, almost like the wind, but unmistakably voices, whispers, murmurs, low and pained, threading together in a chorus of sorrow. I pressed my ear to the boards, and the sound seemed to thrum through me, a cold, insistent pulse that left me trembling. It was impossible to distinguish one voice from another. Some wept, others warned, and a few seemed to scream silently, as though they had lost the ability to speak aloud. The air smelled faintly of earth, and something older, metallic, like blood long settled into stone. I felt the weight of countless gazes, though I could see nothing beneath the floor. The house itself seemed to pulse in time with the voices, each beat echoing the suffering that had been buried, hidden, or ignored for generations. I realized with a sinking clarity that these were the remnants of those claimed by him, trapped between worlds, their existence tethered to our family's sins. Each whisper carried memory, grief or warning, and as I listened, the floorboards seemed to shift subtly underfoot, responding to my presence, guiding me toward truths I was not sure I wanted to know. My chest tightened, my breath shallow, yet I could not look away, could not stop listening. The voices did not speak in words I could fully understand, but I felt them in my bones. They were not angry, not exactly. They were witnesses, trapped and waiting, and their patience was infinite. I thought of my grandmother, of her trembling warnings, and I finally understood the full weight of her fear. She had known this house remembered, that it recorded the trespasses and the tragedies, that it would not forgive the living who ignored its truths. A sudden creak above made me flinch, and for a heartbeat, silence pressed against the room, almost heavier than the murmurs themselves. Then the whispers returned, more insistent, almost pleading, and I realized they were not just warnings, they were asking to be remembered. My hands shook, my mind spun, and I knew that every choice I had made, every curiosity I had indulged, had led me here to a reckoning I could not escape. I stepped back, my foot hovering over a particularly hollow board, and a shiver ran down my spine. The voices surged, a tidal wave of sorrow and accusation, and I knew that the legacy I had inherited was not simply a secret to hide, it was a history of lives claimed and a power that demanded acknowledgement. The moment I looked down at my wrist, I froze. A dark, twisting mark had appeared there, black against my pale skin, almost pulsing with a rhythm that seemed alive. I rubbed at it frantically, thinking it might wash away, but the more I touched it, the hotter it grew, a low burning that spread through my veins. Panic rose like ice in my chest, but beneath it, a strange fascination kept my fingers hovering over the mark, unable to let it go. It was intricate, curling in ways that felt intentional, as if it had been drawn by some unseen hand with purpose. The air around me thickened, smelling faintly of smoke and something earthy, decayed, like damp soil long buried. My heartbeat thundered in my ears, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch toward me, watching, waiting. Every instinct screamed that this was no ordinary mark. I remembered my grandmother's trembling voice, her warnings that names had power and that some lines should never be crossed. And now, staring at the mark, I understood she had not been exaggerating. It was as though the house itself, the air, the whispers beneath the floorboards had conspired to make this moment inevitable. I had crossed a threshold, one that no amount of hesitation could undo. The burning pulsed in time with my fear, each throb a silent message I could not read aloud. Guilt twisted in my stomach, knowing that curiosity and defiance had brought this upon me. And yet, there was a magnetic pull, a fascination that made me trace the dark curves with my fingertips, feeling them almost resonate with my very pulse. I felt tethered, linked to something unseen, something that had waited for this precise moment. A shiver ran up my spine as the shadows seemed to whisper my name, faint, coaxing, almost sorrowful. I clenched my fists, willing the mark to vanish, willing the air to feel normal again, but it remained stubborn and alive. In that moment, fear, guilt, and a dark awe coiled inside me like a living thing, and I realized that my grandmother's warnings were not superstition. They were survival lessons I had ignored at my peril. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding, my wrist aching, the mark throbbing, and I understood the truth. Nothing in this house was idle. Nothing was random. The tether was real, and I was no longer merely a witness to the family legacy. I had become a participant, marked and claimed, and the weight of what I had unleashed pressed down like the very walls themselves. The shadows shifted closer, and I knew with absolute certainty that the next step would not be optional. I found the letter tucked between the yellowed pages of an old ledger, edges brittle and curling like dry leaves. My hands shook as I unfolded it, and the scent of aged paper and faint lavender filled the air, stirring memories of my grandmother's voice and the countless warnings she had whispered over the years. The handwriting was precise, deliberate, almost urgent, each letter looping in a way that made it feel alive, almost watching me as I read. The first lines made my chest tighten, a warning not to forget, not to speak his name, and above all to remember what we had inherited. The words were cryptic, filled with references to rituals I barely understood, to objects and phrases meant to bind a presence I could barely imagine. It spoke of fires and water, of salt and iron, and of nights when the air would carry his sighs. I felt a shiver crawl up my spine, a mixture of fear and awe. My grandmother had not been speaking in superstitions or old wives' tales. She had been preparing us for a reality I had only glimpsed in fleeting shadows and whispered voices. I pressed the letter closer, feeling the pulse of my wrist, the mark still dark and throbbing. The tether seemed to respond, a silent reminder that I was no longer an observer. Every sentence of the letter seemed to weigh on me, layering dread with responsibility. I realized that the curse was not just a story, not a specter of imagination. It was a lineage, a burden passed down through generations, and now it rested squarely on my shoulders. The house itself seemed to listen, the air thickening, carrying faint murmurs I could almost make out. I imagined the walls pressing in, the floors creaking in warning. Every instinct screamed that forgetting, even for a moment, could unravel everything. And yet the more I read, the more I felt the magnitude of the responsibility, the careful balance that had kept our family safe for decades. My grandmother's trembling hands, her silent warnings, the way she had refused to name him, all made sense now. A cold breeze swept through the room, lifting the corners of the letter as if testing my resolve. I realized that the task before me was not simple. Speaking his name, forgetting even once, could unleash the curse, undoing centuries of protection. The weight of the legacy pressed down, but beneath it, a grim determination took hold. I was now part of this story, and there was no turning back. As I folded the letter, a shadow shifted in the corner of my vision, and I knew that he was aware I had read it, that he was watching, waiting for the moment I might falter. The house had changed. I could feel it the moment I stepped inside, the air thick and heavy, as though every corner was holding its breath. Shadows shifted in ways that didn't make sense, stretching too long or curling in corners where no light reached. Faint footsteps echoed across the floors at odd intervals, soft and deliberate, though I was alone. My heart thudded against my ribs, and I kept thinking I would catch a glimpse of him, but the closer I looked, the more slippery he became. I began to keep a journal, marking the times and places where the shadows moved, where the air felt colder, where whispers seemed to settle just behind my ears. It was futile. Patterns dissolved before I could recognize them, and the sense of being watched only deepened. I could feel him in the walls, in the floorboards, a presence that thrived on my fear, drawing strength from my hesitation. The house was no longer just a building. It was a living, breathing entity, and he was its pulse. At night, I would hear the soft creak of doors, the dragging of feet in rooms I had just left. Sometimes it sounded like breathing, slow and steady, filling the silence around me. I tried to tell myself it was imagination, that the stress and the weight of the family's secrets were playing tricks on my mind, but every shadow that twitched and moved in the corner of my eye proved otherwise. I felt the walls leaning closer, the ceilings pressing down, as though the house itself were responding to my thoughts, to my fear. I realized I had become part of a cycle I could neither escape nor understand fully. He was everywhere and nowhere at once, an echo of centuries past, feeding on the silence we had maintained for generations. Each movement, each whisper seemed calculated, deliberate, a reminder that I was still under his gaze. I wanted to flee, to leave the house and never return. But some force held me in place, tethered to this growing darkness that now filled every corner. Late one night, I froze as a shadow detached itself from the wall, sliding silently across the floor toward me. My chest tightened, breath shallow, and I understood that this house, these shadows, and the presence that haunted them were all bound together. I could no longer tell where the fear ended and reality began, and the thought that I might never escape this watchful darkness made the air around me almost unbearable. I backed away slowly, notebook clutched to my chest, and the shadows seemed to retreat just enough to remind me that I was being observed. I arrived at the family reunion, expecting laughter, stories, and old photographs, but the moment I stepped inside, I felt the weight in the air. The house seemed quieter than it should have been, like it was holding its breath, watching. Faces I had known all my life looked tense, and there were glances exchanged that spoke of unspoken fears. I realized quickly that this gathering was not just about catching up. It was a meeting of survivors, each carrying pieces of the same dark history. As relatives began to speak, fragments of memories spilled out, hushed confessions of strange sightings, inexplicable chills, doors that opened on their own. Some had glimpsed him, shadowy and unreal, lingering just long enough to leave a tremor in their hearts. Others felt his presence more subtly, a cold hand brushing the back of the neck, a whisper that seemed to slip into the edges of thought. Every story added weight, and the room felt smaller, heavier, as if the walls themselves were absorbing our fear. I listened to my cousins, uncles, and aunts recount moments I had only imagined, realizing that these experiences were not isolated. The same malevolent awareness had followed all of us, tracing our steps, reminding us that this family's history was not something that could be forgotten or ignored. Guilt sat thick on every tongue, guilt for the past, for surviving when others hadn't, for speaking truths that had been silenced for generations. I could feel it in my own chest, pressing down like a stone. My grandmother's warnings echoed in my mind, clearer than ever. She hadn't just been cautioning me, she had been instructing an entire lineage, teaching us how to bear a burden none of us fully understood. Each confession at that reunion was a thread connecting us, a shared recognition of the legacy that had shaped our lives. We were bound together by it, not just by blood, but by the shadow that had claimed so many before us. As the evening wore on, the air seemed to pulse with a strange rhythm, the house itself leaning in to listen. Every flicker of candlelight made the shadows dance differently, and I felt eyes on me where no one was standing. The reunion had revealed more than family stories. It had shown me the depth of our inheritance, the threads of fear and responsibility tangled across generations. When I left that night, I understood something I had never fully grasped before. This legacy was not mine alone to bear. It had been passed down, collected, nurtured in silence, and it would continue to reach into the lives of those who came after. And somewhere, in the stillness beyond the porch light, I sensed him, patient, watching, waiting for the next whisper to reach him. The moment I found the trapdoor beneath the floorboards, my hands shook uncontrollably. A sense of dread pressed down on me, heavier than anything I had felt in the house before. The journal had been clear. This was the room, the place where the line between our world and his had thinned. Every instinct screamed for me to turn back, to leave the past buried and the air undisturbed, but something deeper, a mix of fear and stubborn curiosity, pulled me forward. I knelt and lifted the door, the hinges groaning like a warning. Dust rose in clouds, stinging my eyes and throat. The air smelled of earth, mold, and something older, metallic, as if the room had absorbed lifetimes of secrets. My flashlight revealed a narrow staircase winding down into darkness that seemed alive, swallowing sound and light. Each step I took echoed, a hollow reminder that I was entering a space not meant for the living. At the bottom, the hidden room unfolded before me, cramped and suffocating, walls etched with strange symbols that twisted and overlapped, almost like they moved when I blinked. Relics were scattered across the floor, cracked porcelain, fragments of clothing, small objects that carried weight I could not name. Every piece seemed to hum, vibrating with an energy I could feel in my chest. Shadows pooled in the corners, thick and restless, and I could almost swear they shifted to follow me. I moved cautiously, brushing my fingers across the carvings, feeling the cold bite of stone and wood. It was as though the room itself was aware of my intrusion, watching, testing. My heart pounded violently, echoing in my ears louder than the silence around me. I thought I heard whispers just beyond comprehension, a susurration that seemed to urge me forward while warning me away at the same time. The air grew heavier, like I was submerged in water, and I felt a pull toward the center of the room, as if the space itself demanded my presence. Fear clawed at my mind, threatening to force me back up the stairs, but I could not stop. This was the threshold, the boundary between ordinary and the world he occupied. I realized then that stepping here was irreversible. The journal had led me to more than answers. It had led me into a living history, a place where mortal and supernatural blended, and I was standing right in the heart of it. I drew a deep breath, trying to steady my trembling hands, and stepped further into the room. Somewhere, deep in the shadows, I felt him watching, and I knew with terrifying clarity that he had been waiting for me all along. The air in the hidden room felt thicker tonight, as if the darkness itself had weight. I held the journal tightly, the worn pages pressed against my chest, each word etched with warnings I had barely dared to understand. The instructions were precise. Speak his name and you confront him, but every line whispered a price, a risk that sent shivers crawling up my spine. My hands shook as I traced the letters, feeling the energy in the room shift, almost waiting, almost alive. I thought about everything I had seen, every shadow that moved when I wasn't looking, every whisper beneath the floorboards. Naming him might give him shape, might call him fully into my world. Or perhaps it would be my only chance to face him, to assert some control over the terror that had dominated my family for generations. My pulse hammered in my ears, a deafening counterpoint to the silence of the room. I felt simultaneously drawn and repelled, a tether between fear and necessity pulling me toward the unknown. The candles I had lit flickered, as if disturbed by a breath I could not feel. I knelt in the center of the room, the symbols etched into the floor beneath me, and tried to steady my voice. I could almost hear the faintest pulse of his presence, a heartbeat that seemed to synchronize with my own. The smell of old wood and something metallic clung to the air, sharp and undeniable. My throat felt tight, my chest pressed by a weight I could not name, and I realized how fragile the line was between this world and the one he inhabited. I whispered the first syllable, halting, tasting the danger in the sound. The shadows seemed to twitch, stretching toward me, waiting. Hesitation battled with the need to continue, every instinct screaming for me to stop, yet something deeper, almost desperate, urged me forward. I could feel the energy coiling around the room, a subtle hum that prickled my skin. Every memory of past warnings, every story my grandmother had whispered in trembling tones, raced through my mind, each one a reminder of what was at stake. When the final syllable left my lips, the room seemed to exhale. The air shifted, colder and heavier, and I felt his awareness like a pressure against my back, unseen but undeniable. I had named him, crossed the threshold that countless generations had feared to approach. And in that instant, I understood the delicate, terrifying balance. I had drawn him closer, but perhaps finally, I had a chance to confront what had haunted us for so long. The moment I stepped into the center of the room, I felt it, the weight of every story, every warning, every secret my family had carried for generations pressing down on me. The shadows stretched and twisted around me, not just dark corners of the house, but living shapes, moving with intent, circling as if aware of my every breath. The air smelled of dust, cold stone, and something metallic, sharp and unsettling, and my skin crawled beneath it. I could hear the walls creak as though the house itself was straining under the presence I had summoned. Then I saw him, not fully formed, yet undeniable. A figure blurred at the edges, yet every detail of his face, his eyes glinting with something both sorrowful and cruel, was etched into my mind. The temperature dropped sharply, my breath turning to mist, and whispers, countless voices trapped for generations, rose to fill the room, each one urgent, pleading, accusing. Panic surged, yet beneath it, a strange focus steadied me. This was the reckoning my grandmother had warned me about. I moved closer, each step echoing through the silence that had become almost unbearable. Shadows lunged, twisting like smoke into shapes I could almost recognize, almost human, almost familiar. They clawed at my periphery, and I flinched, but the figure held my gaze, unblinking, as if testing the very limits of my courage. Every instinct screamed to run, to turn back into the safe ignorance of the past, but I could not. This was not just a confrontation, it was a communion with the legacy itself, a reckoning with every lie, every secret, every hidden death. The whispers became screams, rising and falling, a tide of anguish and fury that filled my chest and shook my bones. The room quaked as if acknowledging the truth of my presence. I could feel every generation's fear, every ancestor's guilt, as though it coursed through me. My hands shook, but I clenched them, feeling the pulse of the house, of the entity, of everything my family had tried to bury. I understood now that fear was only part of it. This was sorrow, grief, and stubborn, unyielding resolve. And then, in the stillest moment between screams, I realized the confrontation was not about victory or escape. It was about recognition, acknowledgement of what had been endured silently across lifetimes. The figure lingered, waiting, watching, no longer entirely shadow, no longer entirely absent. I had faced him, yet I knew this was only the beginning of understanding the depth of the legacy we carried, the weight that would never fully lift. The house was silent in a way that pressed against my ears, a quiet so absolute it felt unnatural. I sat on the cold floor, the air still vibrating with the echoes of what had just passed. My body ached, every muscle trembling, but it was the weight in my chest that I noticed first, a heaviness born not of fear but of understanding. I had survived, yes, but survival had a cost I could already feel coiling through my veins. The mark on my wrist throbbed, dark and twisting like it had a heartbeat of its own. I traced it with a trembling finger, the skin warm, almost alive, and a shiver ran through me. Each pulse reminded me that nothing about what I had learned could be undone. The journal's warnings, my grandmother's cryptic instructions, the whispered horrors under the floorboards, they were all real, tangible, and now mine to bear. I realized with an icy certainty why she had been so adamant. Naming him was not just reckless, it was transformative. It opened a door to truths that the human mind was ill-prepared to carry. I looked around the room, noting the small signs of disturbance, shadows that lingered just a moment too long, the faint scent of something coppery in the air, the way the floorboards creaked under an invisible weight. Everything was unchanged, yet nothing felt normal. I could feel his presence still, not as a figure in the room, but as a memory of force, a resonance that clung to me and the walls alike. It was a warning, and a reminder that some knowledge demanded payment. Guilt coiled inside me, a persistent whisper that no amount of explanation could quiet. I had seen the threads of my family's past, understood the patterns, and yet the awareness came with an unbearable clarity. Those who had come before had endured fear, silence, and secrecy to protect the ones they loved. And now, having crossed the threshold myself, I understood the full weight of that responsibility. The cost of truth was not measured in fear alone. It was measured in a lingering, restless conscience. As I traced the edges of the mark again, a cold wind drifted through the open window, carrying the faintest whisper of a voice I thought I had banished. I froze, knowing the lesson would never leave me. The knowledge I had gained was a shadow that would walk with me always, reminding me that some doors, once opened, cannot be closed. I understood now, survival was only the beginning, and the price of knowledge was far heavier than I had ever imagined. The house is silent, but the silence is wrong. It presses against my ears, thick and unyielding, as though the walls themselves are holding their breath. I walk slowly through the rooms, each step careful, measured, yet the creak of the floorboards feels loud, intrusive, like it disturbs something waiting. The air smells faintly of damp wood, and something older, hidden beneath the layers of dust and memory. I can feel him here, not as a shape, not as a whisper, but as a weight that presses against the edges of my awareness. I pause in the hallway, my hand brushing against the cold plaster wall, tracing the faint cracks that have always been there. Each shadow flickers in the corners of my vision, and though I know the rooms are empty, I feel the subtle shift of something patient watching. The house remembers. I remember. Every creak, every draft, every small disturbance is a fragment of him, of what my family carried silently for generations. The guilt we inherited is heavier than the walls themselves, a gravity that pulls at the chest and makes the heart ache with quiet, relentless pressure. I walk past the old staircase, noting the worn steps that creak beneath my careful weight. Dust motes drift in the pale sunlight, but even the light feels wary, hesitant, as if it cannot fully penetrate the house's memory. I hear nothing, yet every nerve in my body vibrates with tension. The shadows do not move, and yet I feel them shift, stretching along the edges of perception. I realize that some legacies cannot be broken, only endured. We carry them quietly, hidden in the smallest gestures, in the rooms we avoid, in the unspoken rules that govern our lives. The living rooms, the bedrooms, even the attic with its half-forgotten relics, they are all vessels for him, fragments of presence that linger like faint echoes in a dream you cannot shake. I feel my heartbeat tighten, a drum of awareness, knowing I am alone yet not alone, understanding that the endurance demanded is infinite. The air seems thicker now, carrying the faintest whisper of a warning, a reminder that some knowledge and some histories are not meant to leave. I sit in the quietest room, the one where the windows face the old oak in the garden, and I feel the weight in my chest ease slightly, though not vanish. I am aware of the house, of the shadows, of the fragments of him that remain. Some things endure beyond memory, beyond life itself, and this house, silent, patient, holds them all. And so do I, waiting, breathing, carrying what cannot be lifted, knowing the legacy has settled into the corners of my heart. I thought leaving the house would free me. I thought walking away, closing the door behind me, would silence the weight that had pressed against my chest for so long. But the moment my feet hit the gravel path, the air seemed to thrum with the echo of something unseen. Every sound, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of a crow, the whisper of wind against the walls, carried it with it. It followed me, patient, invisible, waiting. I realized then that leaving had not ended anything. The house, and everything it held, was still with me. The road stretched ahead, dim under the evening sky, and my hands shook as I gripped the straps of my bag. The air smelled of wet earth and old wood, as though the garden, the basement, the shadows themselves had clung to me. I could feel the faint prickling on my skin, the sensation of eyes pressing against the back of my neck. Each step forward was heavy, as if I carried more than my own weight. I could almost hear my grandmother's voice, sharp and low in my memory, warning me of what happens when you name what cannot be named, when you touch what should remain untouched. The town looked the same, ordinary, yet every corner, every familiar street, felt different. I knew it was not the streets that had changed, but my perception. I sensed the connection stretching, a tether pulling from the house, from the floorboards, from the hidden rooms where secrets had waited. The mark on my wrist throbbed slightly, a constant reminder that I was bound, that leaving was only physical, spiritually, emotionally. The curse had latched onto me, carrying the weight of generations, the silent legacy of fear and survival. I tried to speak, to tell myself it was gone, that the whispering voices and the shifting shadows were imagination. But the faintest sound, footsteps in the empty alley, the creak of a swing moving in a distant yard, tightened my chest with remembered terror. I understood now that survival was not freedom, and knowledge was not release. I had taken the lessons, the warnings, the burdens, and they had entered me as deeply as blood and bone. Night fell fully, and I paused beneath the lamplight, feeling the cool air brush my face. The shadows stretched long, and I shivered, knowing the connection was alive, patient, eternal. I had left the house, yet the house had not left me. Some legacies are not left behind. They follow, waiting for the moments when we forget, when we falter, when we name what should remain unnamed. And I knew I would carry it, always, as both a warning and a burden, a testament to the survival my grandmother had fought to ensure. I always thought silence was just absence, a hollow space where nothing existed, but years later I finally understand. Silence was never empty. It was alive, protective, a careful boundary drawn by those who came before me. For so long, I had struggled with fear, with the weight of secrets I could not name, thinking it was punishment, or superstition, or just the strange inheritance of an old house. But it was more, much more. I sit in the quiet now, the air thick with memory, and I feel it, the presence I once tried to face, the darkness that lingered in corners, in shadows, in whispers beneath the floorboards. Speaking his name would have been reckless, a breach that no mortal could survive unscathed. My grandmother's warnings echo in my mind, sharper now with years of reflection. She did not forbid us out of cruelty or stubborn tradition. She did it to protect us, to shield us from the legacy that was not ours to wield lightly. I remember the house, the rooms heavy with the scent of old wood and damp earth, the garden where roots hid secrets too ancient to name, the basement where shadows seemed to breathe. Every memory is vivid, every sound, every flicker of movement still alive in my mind. And I know now that the silence surrounding his name was itself a living thing, a barrier, a safeguard forged in fear, guilt, and love. It was a choice to survive. Even the mark on my wrist feels like part of the lesson, a reminder that knowledge carries weight, and that some truths must be held quietly. I understand the whispers, the waiting, the patience of the unseen presence that lingered long after I left the house. It was not malice that demanded silence. It was wisdom, a comprehension of boundaries that my ancestors had learned through blood and fear. I close my eyes and feel the air around me. Hum, gentle, patient, protective. The darkness I once thought I had fought is not a foe to conquer. It is a line not to cross, a threshold never to be named. And I finally grasp what that silence means. It is respect, it is survival, it is love hidden in shadows. To speak would be to unravel it all, to undo generations of care and caution. And so I keep it, the name unspoken, the terror remembered, the boundary intact. The silence is not empty, it is everything, and I finally understand why it must remain.